Ambassador Velda had entered 100 stations in his lifetime fortresses carved into asteroids. Crystal-ringed ports hanging above gas giants. Palaces disguised as trade depots, but Unity's stations still managed to feel overwhelming. It was built for everyone and therefore belonged to no one, a revolving crossroads, where a dozen languages overlapped into a constant murmur, where sense changed from corridor to corridor, and where the very air seemed busy. His diplomatic robes deep purple, woven with the subtle sigils of the Kesher court trailed behind him. As he crossed the airlock threshold, just behind, his daughter moved as though gravity had been dialed up around her alone. Elwisari's should have looked like a living prism. Kesher hair was not merely decorative. It was a sensory lattice, a living extension of the nervous system, grown in crystalline filaments that carried color the way other species carried expression. When a Kesher felt joy, their hair spilled light like sunrise across water. When they were anxious, the hues deepened into storm tones. When they were curious, color ran in quick, bright ripples thought made visible. But Elwisari's hair had gone wrong. It hung in dull curtains of grey, as if someone had drained the spectrum from her. Worse, the lifeless color was only the surface symptom. For 11 months she had lived with pain that never truly left. A pressure behind her eyes, heat like needles under her scalp, and a sensitivity so severe that light, sound, and motion all arrived as violence. When her hair stopped functioning properly, she lost more than beauty. She lost orientation. Half the world became fog. Velda glanced back. The station-side crowd flowed around them, polite, uninterested. Traders argued over shipment claims. A cluster of delegates leaned into one another with practiced smiles that meant nothing. Two species Velda didn't recognize gestured over a tablet, their body language sharp with negotiation. Elwisari saw none of it. Her attention was folded inward, all her energy spent simply remaining upright. "We're almost there," Velda said softly, pitching his voice to the gentle tones he used when he wanted to pretend everything could still be normal. "You'll be able to rest." She nodded without lifting her eyes. Fingers pressed to her temples as though she could hold her skull together by will alone. Their assigned suite was clean, spacious, and politely sterile, the kind of accommodation designed to offend no one. Elwisari crossed it like a ghost and vanished into the bedroom at the back. Within seconds, the curtains were drawn tight against the viewport. The room dimmed. Silence thickened. Velda stood in the outer room for a moment, listening to his own breathing. He had negotiated ceasefires between systems that had been at war for generations. He had talked pirates into becoming legitimate contractors. He had watched councils teeter on the edge of collapse and held them steady with nothing but words. And none of that mattered, because his daughter was suffering, and he could not bargain with pain. He had already tried everything. Specialists on 12 worlds. Xenobiologists who mapped nerve clusters in shimmering three-dimensional projections. Diagnostic arrays that could read cellular activity like weather. One physician suggested a degenerative condition and spoke about preparing the family. Another hinted at parasites, rare and clever, unseen by standard instrumentation. A third, careful with every syllable, implied stress, emotional distress. That had turned inward until it manifested as physical agony. Velda didn't know what he wanted from them. A cure, a name. Even an explanation would have been something to hold. But each appointment ended the same way: clinical sympathy and the quiet admission that they could not help. That evening, the station's grand hall hosted the mandatory opening reception for the treaty talks. Velda had considered skipping it. He could almost feel the risk, how quickly absence was interpreted as insult. How easily the first night's misstep could sour negotiations before they began. The Keshri Empire's interests were not a personal matter. Colonies, shipping corridors, defensive alliances, an entire network of stability depended on careful diplomacy. El-Wasari insisted he go. "If you don't," she said from the darkness of her room, voice thin but steady, "they'll blame you. And then you'll blame yourself. Go. I can be alone for a few hours." So Velda went, wearing the correct smile and speaking the correct words, while his mind stayed locked on the soundless room. Behind those curtains, the reception was an exercise in elegant emptiness. Toasts to unity, speeches about cooperation. The same carefully polished phrases repeated by people who had built careers on saying nothing. Directly, he was halfway through a conversation about tariff corridors when a human approached. The man was middle-aged, with faint gray at his temples, and the kind of face that looked used to sunlight and ordinary work. His expression held something Velda didn't often see in diplomats: uncomplicated concern. "Ambassador Velda," the human asked. "I'm Robert Hayes, Human Diplomatic Corps. I hope I'm not interrupting." Velda's instinct was to deflect, a pleasant lie, a diplomatic brush-off. But Hayes's eyes flicked briefly, discreetly to the corridor Velda had walked earlier, where El-Wasari had struggled behind him. "I saw you arrive," Hayes said quietly. "Your daughter. She didn't look well. Is she all right?" Something in Velda cracked open. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the relief of hearing someone ask a real question rather than a strategic one. 11 months of fear and helplessness surged up behind his ribs. "She's in constant pain," Velda admitted, keeping his voice low. "For my people, the hair it's sensory. It's part of how we perceive. Hers has been damaged. She's losing her senses, and the pain is relentless. We've gone everywhere. No one can tell me why." Hayes listened without interrupting. When Velda paused, as if realizing he'd said too much to a stranger, the human didn't retreat. He thought for a moment, then spoke carefully. "This might sound odd," Hayes said, "but I know someone on the civilian deck, Diana Cole. She runs a salon. She works with all kinds of species, more than most doctors ever see. Honestly, she isn't a physician. I want to be clear about that. But she's observant. Sometimes a different kind of expertise helps. A salon, a hairdresser." Velda almost laughed, an ambassador begging for miracles, and offered scissors and combs. "And yet, when your world has narrowed to a single suffering face, pride becomes irrelevant. What do I have to lose?" he asked himself. "Take us to her," he said aloud. The next morning, Velda guided El-Wasari through Unity Station's civilian level. The corridor smelled of cooking oils and warm metal. Shops displayed fabrics that floated as if underwater, tools with inscrutable purposes, jars of preserved flora from worlds with 3 suns. Music drifted from somewhere, too bright for El-Wasari, who winced with each sharp note. They found the storefront with a simple sign, Diana's Cuts and Style, through the window. Velda saw walls crowded with photographs, faces unlike any he'd ever met, all wearing carefully shaped hair, tendrils, spines, feathers, and living fiber arrangements that made the room feel like a celebration of diversity, rather than a clinic. A bell chimed as they stepped inside. Diana Cole looked up from her workstation, wiping her hands on a cloth. She was in her mid-30s, hair pulled back in a practical tie, wearing comfortable work clothes rather than any kind of uniform. Her eyes were warm and quick. "Ambassador Velda," she said, as though greeting him were no stranger than greeting the next client. "Robert told me you might come, and you must be El-Wasari." El-Wasari offered a faint nod, squinting even. In the salon's gentle lighting, Diana noticed immediately. Without fuss, she crossed the room and dimmed the overheads further, leaving only soft pools of light. "Is that better?" she asked. El-Wasari exhaled, some tension loosening from her shoulders. "Yes," she whispered. "All right," Diana said. "Let's take this slow. Sit wherever you're comfortable." The chair Diana offered could tilt and recline, and El-Wasari lowered herself into it as if preparing for impact. Velda began to speak 11 months of tests, diagnostic scans, consultations, but Diana's attention stayed on El-Wasari's hair, her gaze tracking its dull strands with the focus of someone reading a map. "I'm not a doctor," Diana said once Velda ran out of breath. "I don't want you expecting medical miracles, but I've been doing hair for 23 years, and I've worked on station clients for almost a decade. I've learned that sometimes what hurts isn't what people think it is." She turned to El-Wasari. "May I touch it? I'll be gentle." El-Wasari tensed, then nodded. Bracing herself, Diana's hands moved with extraordinary care. No tugging, no harsh manipulation. She didn't treat the hair like a thing to be controlled. She treated it like a living surface that could feel her intention, using only her fingertips. She separated strands in tiny sections and watched El-Wasari's face for signs of discomfort. Then Diana retrieved an old-fashioned magnifying lens, simple glass, no electronics. She leaned in close. Minutes passed. The station's background hum filled the quiet. Velda's hope tried to rise, and he pushed it down. Hope had become dangerous. It lifted you just high enough to drop you again. Diana froze. "Ambassador," she said softly, "come here." She angled the lens toward Velda's eyes. Embedded within the crystalline fibers, deep near the roots, were tiny metallic flecks so small they looked like glitter, except their edges caught the light wrong. Barbs, hooks, dozens of them scattered through different sections. Like shrapnel that had learned to hide, Velda's throat went dry. "What is that?" El-Wasari's eyes widened. A memory hit her with visible force. "The headpiece," she rasped. "From my birthday celebration, grandmother's ceremonial gift." Velda remembered the ornate circlet threaded with decorative metal filaments. He remembered noticing, at the end of the night, that it had begun to shed. They had spent hours combing out fragments, convinced they'd gotten all of them. Convinced. Diana straightened, her expression serious but not dramatic. "Your hair connects to nerves," she said. "It's sensory tissue. These fragments have barbed edges. Over time, with movement, they've worked deeper. Every shift is like a tiny stab. That would explain the headaches, the sensitivity, the gradual loss of function." Velda felt dizzy with the simplicity of it. Not a mysterious disease. Not a genetic curse. Foreign objects physical, real, fixable. How did no one see it? He demanded, anger flashing for the first time in months. How did 12 worlds of doctors miss this? Diana didn't sound accusatory when she answered. Only honest. Because they weren't looking for it, she said. Medical scanners focus on biological anomalies. Metal debris probably gets filtered out as irrelevant, and specialists are trained to chase complex causes. Sometimes the simplest answer isn't on their checklist. Elwasari's voice shook. "Can you remove them?" Diana's gaze softened. "I can try, but I need you to understand. It's delicate work. If I rush, I could damage you more. This will take multiple sessions. It might hurt at times, but if we do it carefully, you might finally get relief." Elwasari turned her head slightly toward her father, asking without words. Velda nodded, unable to trust his voice. "Please," Elwasari said, "help me." Diana rolled up her sleeves like someone about to fix a stubborn engine. She gathered tools that looked almost primitive compared to the xenomedical equipment Velda had seen. Fine picks, tweezers, combs, a few bottles of oils, and that same magnifying lens. She began. For the first half hour, she said almost nothing. She applied a thin oil to one section, explaining it would make the crystalline strands more flexible and reduce breakage. Then she isolated a single fragment, barely visible even under magnification, and worked it loose with movements so small they were nearly imperceptible. Elwasari gripped the chair's armrests, waiting for pain. When the first piece came free, she blinked in surprise. "That's one," Diana murmured, holding up the fragment with tweezers under the lens. Its barbs looked cruelly designed. Velda stared. In the newly cleared section, the grey began to lighten faint hints of gold threading through like dawn. Elwasari inhaled sharply, not in pain, but in sensation. "I can feel," she whispered. "A little. Right there." The first session lasted 2 hours. Diana removed 8 fragments, then stopped, rubbing her eyes and stretching her hands. "That's enough for today," she said. "Your scalp needs recovery time, and I need to keep my focus sharp." Elwasari sat up straighter than she had in weeks. The pain in her face always there, always tightening her features, had loosened into something that almost resembled peace. "It's better," she said, astonished. "It's actually better." They returned the next day. Diana had adjusted the salon further, a directed lamp that illuminated only the section she worked on, leaving the rest of the room dim. A small screen positioned so Elwasari could watch shows during the long stretches of stillness. "I'm not great at chatting when I'm concentrating," Diana admitted. so this might help pass the time. Over the following days, the process became a rhythm. Elwasari arrived, settled into the chair, and Diana worked with patient precision. Some sessions yielded 6 fragments, others only 3 when the pieces were especially embedded or near what Diana described as major nerve clusters. Word traveled quickly on a station built on gossip and curiosity. On the 3rd day, a human maintenance technician named Gary arrived with coffee for Diana and a sympathetic nod for Elwasari. The day after, Bethany from engineering brought snacks and a deck of playing cards. "My kid loves these," Bethany said, showing Elwasari the cards during a break. "I can teach you, if you want." Elwasari looked bewildered. "Why are you doing this?" Bethany blinked, genuinely confused by the question. "Because you're having a hard time. That's enough." An older man from hydroponics brought flowers to brighten the counter. A young communications worker stopped by with a soft blanket. Thinking Elwasari might get cold sitting still so long, no one asked for favors. No one hinted at influence. They simply helped because help was possible. Velda, who lived in a universe of transactions, found himself shaken by it. By the end of the first week, Diana had removed close to 40 fragments. Elwasari's transformation was visible even to passing strangers. Whole sections of her hair shimmered with true color again: clear blues, gentle greens, warm golds. She could tolerate normal lighting. She began to laugh at Bethany's card game jokes. She ate with something like appetite. During one session, Elwasari asked the question that had been building in her like a puzzle. "The doctors had machines that could scan my entire body in seconds," she said, watching Diana's hands in the mirror. "Equipment worth more than a ship. You're using a magnifying glass and tools that look ancient. How did you find what they missed?" Diana worked a fragment loose, set it into a growing dish of metal pieces, and then sat back. They were trained to expect a certain kind of answer, Diana said. Their tools are amazing at the thing they're made to do. But if the problem doesn't match the categories their tools recognize, it becomes invisible. She thought for a moment, searching for an analogy Elwasari would understand. "Imagine a library," Diana said, "a perfect computerized catalog. You search, and it finds any book, as long as the book is correctly labeled. But if the spine is damaged or it's misfiled, the computer won't help you. Someone has to walk the aisles, look with their own eyes, and notice what doesn't fit." Elwasari nodded slowly. "So they were searching the catalog. You were walking the shelves." "Exactly," Diana said, and smiled. "I've spent decades staring at hair. I know what foreign object looks like. I know how damage hides." 2 weeks after Elwasari first entered the salon, only a few dull patches remained, stubborn areas where the final fragments still lurked. The last session arrived on a Thursday afternoon. This time, several humans gathered quietly in the corners: Gary, Bethany, the hydroponics worker, and others drawn by the story of the alien girl whose pain was being solved not by miracle tech, but by patience. Diana leaned in close, voice low. "Last one." The final fragment had embedded deepest, near the base of Elwasari's skull. Diana had saved it for last. refining her technique on easier extractions first. Now she worked with almost eerie steadiness, adjusting angles by fractions, coaxing the barb out without tearing sensory tissue. Silence held the room. Then the fragments slid free. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Elwasari inhaled, and her hair erupted into color. Not in patches, but in a cascading wave. Gold rolled into deep ocean blue, sparked into emerald, flared with sunset orange. Then shifted again, as if the spectrum itself had become an emotion. Elwasari stood slowly, staring at her reflection as though afraid it might vanish. Her face looked younger, lighter. The pain lines were gone. "I can feel everything," she whispered, wonder flooding her voice. Air currents, heat, the shape of the room. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned and wrapped Diana in a fierce hug. "Thank you," Elwasari sobbed. "Thank you for giving me back myself." The humans burst into spontaneous applause, the sound bright and unrestrained. Diana hugged Elwasari tightly, eyes damp. When Velda stepped forward, his composure so carefully constructed over decades wavered. He bowed formally to Diana. "You have saved my daughter," he said. "Name your price. My resources might influence anything you want." Diana held up a hand, gentle but firm. "My rate's on the wall, 40 credits an hour for complex cases. We did about 36 hours. That's 1440. Velda stared as if he'd misheard. "That is trivial." "It's fair," Diana said. "It's what I'd charge anyone. Your daughter doesn't become a different kind of client because you're important." Bethany, leaning against the counter, added with a shrug, "We help because help is needed, not because it buys something." Velda looked around at the humans' maintenance, engineering, hydroponics, communications, ordinary people who had offered time and kindness with no expectation of return. For the first time, he understood that humanity's primitive reputation wasn't a weakness. It was an orientation. They still knew how to use their hands, their eyes, their attention. The following week, treaty negotiations resumed. When Velda was granted the floor, he did not speak of warships, economic output, or territorial claims. Instead, he projected images of Elwasari before and after gray-haired agony contrasted with radiant restoration. "My daughter suffered a condition that our best specialists could not diagnose," he told the gathered delegates. 12 worlds failed her. Do you know who succeeded? A human hairdresser with a magnifying lens and practical experience. Murmurs rolled through the chamber like wind through tall grass. Velda continued, voice steady. Humanity's strength is not only in what they build, but in how they think. They do not assume complexity for its own sake. They observe, they improvise, they persist, and when someone needs help, they help. Without calculation, an elderly delegate rose to speak of their own people losing the hands-on instincts they once prized. Others followed with stories. Human technicians repairing water systems with improvised parts. Human negotiators settling disputes through unorthodox reasoning. Human crews volunteering in emergencies simply because they were there. By the time the vote was called, the outcome felt inevitable. Humanity's petition for full council membership passed by a sweeping margin. That night, the celebration was held not in a grand hall, but in a modest salon on the civilian deck. Elwasari arrived with her hair glowing in delighted golds and excited purples. Behind her came families from other delegations' parents with children, elders with brittle sensory fibers, beings who had lived for years with unsolvable hair-related pain. They looked at Diana Cole the way Velda once looked at a council chamber, with hope. Diana surveyed the crowd and laughed, equal parts delighted and overwhelmed. "All right," she said, already reaching for an extra chair. "Looks like I'm going to need to expand." In the months that followed, she trained other human stylists in the methods she developed: slow extraction, patient observation, detailed mapping of alien fiber structures. What began as a single act of skill and compassion became a new specialty: practical xenological care, built on the simple principle that sometimes the answer isn't hidden in a machine's readout, but in what you see when you truly look. Elwasari stayed on Unity Station to study human culture. She wrote about the human advantage: fresh eyes, flexible minds, and a tendency to help because help was possible. Years later, when she became an ambassador herself, she kept a small, magnifying lens on her desk. When other delegates asked why, she would smile and say, "It reminds me that the galaxy's greatest solutions aren't always the most advanced. Sometimes they're the most attentive, and sometimes the most powerful thing a civilization can offer the stars is not its technology, but its willingness to notice what everyone else has stopped seeing."